Welcome to Module 3 of the CoC 101 training series for the Eastern PA Continuum of Care. This module will focus on the coordinated entry system and what is coordinated entry. So you may have heard the term coordinated entry, sometimes known as CE, sometimes known as CES, which stands for Coordinated Entry System. Coordinated entry is a process designed to coordinate access, assessment, and referrals to homeless services and housing for folks who are experiencing a housing crisis. And coordinated entry's goals are to basically create an easier, more accessible, more streamlined way for folks to access homeless services and to streamline the process for referrals to homeless assistance. And the coordinated entry system uses a standardized assessment process for everyone. So everyone coming to seek services through the CoC's coordinated entry system should be receiving the same standardized assessment process. Another goal is to prioritize assistance for those with the most severe needs and longest histories of homelessness, and those who are likely to be unable to end their homelessness without assistance. So as you are likely aware, the CoC has limited resources to serve all the folks who are experiencing homelessness. So the coordinated entry system really intends to help prioritize assistance for those with the highest needs. So why do we have a coordinated entry system? First of all, it is a HUD requirement. HUD requires that all CoCs operate a coordinated entry process. And another reason why we have it is really to make services more accessible for folks who are experiencing a housing crisis. We want it to be easier to get the resources someone needs, a process that's more consistent, and to prioritize the limited resources based on the highest need. Not only is the goal to improve services for people experiencing a housing crisis, but also to create a more coordinated process for the service providers so that service providers are getting more appropriate referrals and ultimately less time screening folks for their program. So you'll see this visual on the left-hand side of the screen. So without the coordinated entry system, it's often a maze. You are navigating this maze to try to find housing, and it is confusing, and it's not streamlined, and it's not coordinated. With the coordinated entry system, the goal is to make the system more streamlined, to have a standard way for people to be assessed, and then a process to identify assistance, and then to connect folks to housing resources, integrating client choice as well. So we're going to talk about all of the elements of the coordinated entry system. There are 4 key elements to the coordinated entry system. First is access. So how do folks access the system? Do folks call in? Do they go in person? Is it available for folks who are residing on the streets, for example, through street outreach? Where and how do folks access the system? The second is assessment. So what questions are you asking people to assess both their eligibility for services as well as establishing priorities? So some of the pieces of the assessment could be an initial triage. What are the immediate needs of the person? Diversion, trying to help divert the person from the homeless system if possible and appropriate. Intake, initial assessment, kind of getting the basic info. Potential eligibility assessment, so what resources someone eligible for. And then a comprehensive assessment that basically kind of make sure you get all the necessary information you need from someone to refer them to the most appropriate housing resource. Not every coordinated entry system is going to use each one of these phases of assessment, but most coordinated entry systems integrate at least some elements of all these things, such as triage, diversion, intake, eligibility, that sort of thing. The third element is prioritization. So once you've assessed a household for services, you are going to use the information provided to help prioritize those for assistance. So the folks with the most immediate needs, most complex needs, highest needs are intended to be prioritized first for housing. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then referral. Once you've prioritized folks, it's getting folks to the most appropriate housing resource based on their needs. A little bit more about access. Coordinated entry systems must have a defined entry point to access homeless assistance within the CoC. And this varies from CoC to CoC. It can be a physical access point, which could be one location, or it could be multiple locations, or it could be virtual access, such as folks calling in by phone or folks accessing resources through a web-based platform. Regardless of kind of how you set up your access, you need to ensure that your coordinate entry system covers the entire geography of the CoC and is easily accessible and well advertised. In terms of assessment, all CoC coordinate entry systems must use a standardized assessment tool to identify the needs of households seeking housing or services, and this must be the same assessment process at all access points. So if you have a couple of physical access points, as well as folks able to call in by phone, all of those should be using the same assessment process. And the folks who are conducting the assessments, the assessors, must be trained in conducting the assessment. A note on subpopulations. As we noted, the coordinate entry system must be accessible to all populations within the CoC, but you can have different processes for accessing coordinate entry, including different access points and different assessment tools for the following populations, which are adults without children, adults with children, unaccompanied youth, or households fleeing domestic violence. A bit on prioritization. So the CoC must create a process to prioritize households for referral to housing and services. In essence, how is the CoC going to prioritize its limited resources, and who is going to be first to get those resources? So the goal is to ensure that people with the most severe service needs and highest vulnerability are prioritized, as opposed to a first come, first served system. And then referral. The CoC must have a uniform and coordinated referral process for all housing and services, and it must follow those prioritization policies. So all housing programs who are participating in coordinate entry, which at a minimum includes all CoC and ESG funded housing resources and sometimes other resources as well, have to follow the same process for accepting referrals. They have to follow the prioritization policies and the process. And the goal is not to have side doors. So for example, if you know someone at a certain agency and you're going to call them up and say, hey, can you get this person in? That's not really how it works anymore with the coordinate entry system, because the process has to be fair for everyone, regardless of whether you kind of have an in somewhere, and it has to be have all those elements such as prioritizing those who are most vulnerable, a standardized process, etc. So a little bit more about how all this works in the Eastern PA continuum of care. So in terms of access, the Eastern PA CoC uses a combination of phone through PA 211 and physical access sites. The assessment is a phased assessment approach, meaning folks are only asked the questions that are needed at each phase. So not everyone may receive every single phase of the assessment. For example, maybe someone just needs an initial triage assessment and then they can be connected to a more appropriate resource. Or maybe someone's able to be diverted from the homeless system. And you don't want to ask that person every single question in the assessment if really what they need is something more immediate or maybe outside the homeless system. So it's a phased assessment approach and currently uses the VI-SPDAT assessment tool. VI-SPDAT stands for Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool. And this is the assessment tool that's used to assess folks for different housing interventions. And there's 3 different versions. There's a version for singles, people without children, families with children, and then youth under 25. In terms of prioritizations, providers must follow the CoC's written standards, but in general, just to give you a sneak peek of what that means, the prioritization is generally based on the VI-SPDAT score. So a person with a higher score would likely be prioritized sooner. The length of time homeless. So for example, someone who's chronically homeless and has been homeless for an extended period of time would be prioritized. and also folks who are unsheltered. The by name list, also sometimes referred to as the BNL and HMIS, helps housing providers see which clients should be prioritized next. So they can see things like the VI SPDAT score, length of time homeless, current living situation, things like that. And in terms of referral, each of the 5 RABs, each of the 5 regions in the CoC has a coordinated entry regional manager, and that person supports providers with the referral process, manages the coordinated entry by name list. So that's a quick overview of the coordinated entry system. This is the end of the CoC 101 training series, but we'll come back for the CoC 201 training series. The CoC 101 training series really just gave you the basics about what the continuum of care is all about. CoC 201 will dive more deeply into some of the topics related to the CoC. So we hope that you will join us for the CoC 201 training.